Hi, everyone. It's 4 o'clock in New York. A topic that was once only whispered about and often pinned on GOP Senator Bob Corker's lone public pronouncement that Donald Trump lacked the competence and stability to be president. Well, it's now a topic that Donald Trump tweets about. The stakes higher than ever for his presidency, with NBC News reporting today that initial talks are underway about a Trump interview with special counsel Bob Mueller as part of his inquiry into whether Trump's campaign colluded with Russia. Against that backdrop, Trump spent the weekend firing off missives like this one. Quote, "Now that Russian collusion, after 1 year of intense study, has proven to be a total hoax on the American public, the Democrats and their lapdogs, the fake news mainstream media, are taking out the old Ronald Reagan playbook and screaming mental stability and intelligence." Ronald Reagan disclosed in 1994 that he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Donald Trump tweeted about Reagan a second time over the weekend, writing, quote, "I've had to put up with the fake news from the first day I announced that I would be running for president. Now I have to put up with a fake book written by a totally discredited author. Ronald Reagan had the same problem and handled it well. So will I." But he didn't leave it there. Quote, "Actually, throughout my life, my two greatest assets have been mental stability and being, like, really smart." Crooked Hillary Clinton also played these cards very hard, and as everyone knows, went down in flames. "I went from very successful businessman to top TV star to president of the United States on my first try. I think that would qualify as not smart, but genius, and a very stable genius at that." The president was asked about his tweets about mental fitness at Camp David.
This morning you were tweeting about your mental state. Why did you feel the need to tweet about that this morning?
Well, only because I went to the best colleges, or college. I went to I had a situation where I was a very excellent student, came out, made billions and billions of dollars, became one of the top business people, went to television, and for 10 years was a tremendous success, as you probably have heard. Ran for president one time and won. And then I hear this guy that doesn't know me at all. By the way, did not interview me he said he interviewed me for 3 hours in the White House. It didn't exist, okay? It's in his imagination.
And today, Donald Trump spent the afternoon on Air Force One with none other than Senator Bob Corker. The president set to deliver remarks in just a few moments in Corker's home state of Tennessee. We'll monitor that and bring you any news that they make. But let's get to our reporters and guests. With us from the Washington Post, White House reporter Ashley Parker, and with us at the table, New York Times chief White House correspondent Peter Baker, politics editor for The Root, Jason Johnson. Donny Deutsch is back, and with us from Florida, former Republican Congressman David Jolly. Ashley Parker, let me start with you. Your reporting from the weekend really encapsulates and gives some context to the developments that I just went through. But I want to ask you, as a reporter, these are questions that are among the most sensitive kinds of questions. And other than questions I fielded about Sarah Palin's pregnancy when I worked for her in 2008, I can't imagine sort of a more sensitive kind of topic for a reporter to broach with the president or a politician and their staff than their mental stability. And I wonder what the effect has been of Donald Trump tweeting a half a dozen tweets on the topic and now making public statements about the topic. Has he, wittingly or unwittingly, thrust this issue into the limelight for those who cover him?
That's a great question. I should say up front, of course, we're reporters. We're not psychiatrists. It's not our job to diagnose anyone's mental stability or lack thereof. But what was interesting about those tweets is that the president's own team has sort of taken this stance of kind of concerted umbrage and outrage and indignation, which is that they won't even sort of deal with the actual question at hand because they get mad at the questioner or they get mad at the source of where the question may be coming from, which in this case, for the past week at least, is Michael Wolff's book. You are right that the president, contrary to sort of the strategy laid out by his team, addressed that question very head on and defended himself against that. But it did in a way make it perhaps a bit easier, again, in the briefing room to pose a question that the president himself is now engaging in that discussion.
And Ashley, the White House announcing, I think, aboard Air Force One in a gaggle that the president's physical, which is scheduled for the end of this week, will not include a psychiatric exam.
Yes, and again, I think if you look at the way the spokesperson aboard Air Force One handled that question, it's very in line with not necessarily what the president just did, but in line with the White House strategy, which is he basically said no. It was very much a one-word answer. He's not even going to get into why that might be a question, why some people might want that. And again, I believe it's up to the White House when a president does go and get these physicals, how much information they choose to release. So in this case, they're saying there's not going to be sort of a psychological portion of his physical. But even if there was, I don't think the White House would be under any obligation to release the results if they didn't want to.
Peter Baker, we started this conversation at the end of last week when the book broke, and among the things that the White House was pressing back against, they were mostly related to the Russia investigation. There was a broad indictment of the reporter's tactics. The first thing the White House did to rapidly respond, and as a former White House staffer, and you covered the White House in which I worked, I'm always interested in response. The first thing they did was pull the logs to try to say he wasn't here that much. That ended up not being particularly exculpatory because he'd been there for 17 hours-long visits, and that's just what they shared with us. I wonder if you can talk about the delta, if you will, between what's being said publicly, statements like Mike Pompeo, CIA director, confirming that he can read, which we know because we've covered teleprompter speeches. We figured he could string together sentences. And the difference between that kind of defense and really knocking back, which is what is at the essence of this, which goes to the heart of fitness to be the president, the commander-in-chief.
Well, that's right, exactly. Look, there are two different things here. We're talking about fitness versus, physical and mental health, and we're not doctors. What we can judge is the way he's conducted himself, and that conversation over this last year has led us to this point. Whereas we've seen very publicly, we didn't need Michael Wolff to tell us, we've seen very publicly that his behavior at times seems erratic, it seems different, it seems volatile. We haven't seen presidents like that, and so of course people are looking for an explanation. Is this just who he is? Is this something, physical or medical? And that's why we're having this conversation. But it's an extraordinary conversation to have. We've never had it. Forget the Ronald Reagan thing. It's just not even close. We didn't have this conversation.
So the first line in the piece with your byline and your colleague Maggie Haberman's line is just that this is a president whose erratic behavior, it's all of, and again, not one of us, except maybe Donny, can diagnose this man. I don't know him. But it's the public-facing things. We are examining what faces the public, and what faces the public are tweets about nuclear war. The title of the book came from a tweet about fire and fury raining down on North Korea. Well, there's no fire and fury in North Korea without grim casualties for the rest of the Korean Peninsula. So this conversation has not only been legitimized by the president's outward-facing behaviors, it's been legitimized by the deafening silence of the people closest to him.
Well, that's right. And you mentioned, Ashley, is this difficult for reporters to even raise this question? And when we started off covering this president about a year ago, I thought this issue might come up at some point because we had seen on the campaign trail, even Republican opponents had used words like crazy and kook. And it occurred to us that at some point down the road, this might come up as an issue to confront as journalists. And I have to say, he's made it very easy. He's the one who came out with the tweet saying, I'm very stable, I've got a lot of good college credits and so forth. And suddenly it's not only easy, it's a legitimate and important thing for journalists to raise. What are the questions that need to be answered at this point? And it's, as a reporter who's done this for a while, I've never thought we'd be at this point.
And David Jolly, I don't know if the president doesn't know, has never heard Michael Deaver, the late Michael Deaver's sort of post-White House, really heartfelt, really honest, really frank articulations of what it was like to see Ronald Reagan age. And let's just assert every president, every man, there's never been a woman, every man ages at warp speed in the presidency. But Ronald Reagan he was officially diagnosed and revealed to the country in 1994 that he'd been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. But if you go back, and I watched some of them on YouTube today, and you watch Michael Deaver, you watch some of the other people who were around Ronald Reagan, I wondered today, rereading Donald Trump's tweets about Reagan, if he knew that Ronald Reagan was suspected to have had the early signs of Alzheimer's during his second term as president.
Sure, in his 6th year. And you're right about how it ages a president. We saw it in Bush 43. We saw it in Obama. But, Nicolle, this is a very grave conversation. It has been over 30 years since this nation had a conversation about whether or not our president was fit to serve. And that's a very grave conversation. And the important thing in this is if we are having the conversation, that necessarily means that there is concern among the body politic. You know, there is an axiom in politics, and you know this well, if you're explaining, you ain't campaigning. And my apologies to my fifth grade grammar teacher, but the reality is on that, if you are talking about the president's mental fitness, you are not on message regarding his agenda nor the interest of the country. And so what we are seeing among this president, whether it be true or not, is based on his own irascible behavior. We're having a national conversation that not is just challenging for the president, but is challenging for the country.
And Jason, I want to put this question to you without sort of casting any personal judgment on it. One of the reasons you and I were on the air together, I think after Charlottesville. Right. One of the explanations we've heard when we've called out people like Gary Cohn, people like H.R. McMaster, people like Dina Powell, why do you stay? Why doesn't that make you walk away when someone describes good people on both sides? And the explanation that sort of filtered out, what made it out into the public, was that they were there for the country. Right. Is it possible that they saw more of this than what we're talking about, that which is public facing? And when they said we're there for the country, they said we're there to protect the country from him? Right.
I believe it. I believe it. Look, there are real patriots in the White House. Now, how they demonstrate their patriotism may not be the way that I view with my patriotism, but they want to protect this country. They think there are certain things on Trump's agenda that need to be accomplished for the good of this country, and they're willing to tolerate what is some erratic and sometimes problematic behavior in order to get there. I think it's about loyalty. But the issue is this, and I agree, you know, this is a grave conversation. I think it's important that we sort of step away from sort of the Fraser Crane armchair quarterbacking, because he hasn't sat down with a psychiatrist, right? He hasn't sat down with a psychologist, none that's necessarily communicated with the public. So I'm not likely to say, hey, I don't know if the guy's mentally unfit. I will say this. Barack Obama said this last year during the campaign. He's like, he doesn't have the temperament for the job. And I always thought that was one of the most salient things that the former president said. He's like, there's a certain temperament you have to have with this job, and this man doesn't have it. I don't necessarily think he's mentally ill, but I think people are catering to somebody who doesn't have the temperament to do it.
But you don't know the answer to the first.
Right, I don't. None of us do.
None of us do. And I want to ask you, Donny Deutsch, I want to ask you to cut. You don't have the obligation Peter and Ashley do, which is his journalistic responsibility to observe what is public facing, and you know him.
Yeah, 20 years.
And I want to ask you if what you see now is the same person you saw 20 years ago.
I must say I'm usually wrong, but on this one, a few months into his presidency, I was one of the few people, along with you, out there saying, wait a second, we have to start looking at this, because it's about behavior. You know, up until while he was running, I thought he was dastardly and evil, but there was a logic to everything, even the bad things he did. We could decipher 20, 30 things in his first 4 or 5 months in office that the only explanation was he's not well. You can't, you ran out of deductive reasoning.
Well, you once read the definition of a sociopath. I mean, is that still your opinion?
Honestly, it's interesting. Nobody's diagnosing, but if anybody goes to the dictionary thesaurus and looks up sociopath, stunningly, you will see attributes that describe our president. Once again, I'm not diagnosing him. The other thing also, I have known him a long time, and I looked at an hour interview I did with him in 2007. His cadence was different. His eyes were different. And he's clearly not well. We didn't need Michael Wolff's book to do this. I love Michael Wolff. I almost went into business with him. He's a fantastic guy, and I think it's brought up a new energy. But I don't think anybody with any reasoning could come up with any other conclusion. It's not about calling names.
Right.
It's just about a behavior analysis. If somebody runs through the subway naked and is throwing turds against the wall, we don't need to diagose them. The behavior speaks for itself.
So you're in a category with another one of my colleagues here, Joe Scarborough, someone who's known him for a long time. Let me show you what Joe Scarborough observed with the same sort of body of familiarity, having known him a long time. We'll talk about it on the other side.
For the past year, we've had people around Donald Trump, and even during the campaign, saying he's not mentally fit to be president. Now, I mean, and there is such a reluctance, and I'm certainly not knocking the Washington Post. They're actually being conservative with a small c. I've written twice in my column a quote about one of people closest to Donald Trump during the campaign, saying he's got early stage of dementia. He repeats the same stories over and over again. His father had it, and it's getting worse, and not a single person who works for him doesn't know he has early signs of dementia.
David Brooks from the New York Times also reported in a column in October that senators who left a meeting with Donald Trump hypothesized that he had the early stages of dementia. Let me show you Wolf's response to part of that conversation, also from Morning Joe this morning.
In the past, you know, as I said, New York Magazine, when I used to speak to him, I never thought, it didn't cross my mind. It crossed my mind that he was a bragger and an egotist, and also quite funny often. Mm-hmm. But never did I think, oh, there's some. This is peculiar in otherworldly ways. Now that is clearly true. I mean, the repetitions are. You don't know what to do.
Ashley Parker, I want to ask you, I'm not going to ask you to diagnose the president, but I do want to ask you if one of the kinds of explanations you hear from aides who are presented with just this growing pile of deeds that are at best questionable, and I don't know if you hear what I hear, but lots of times when I ask White House sources about the tweets, they say, oh, I didn't see the latest one. It's almost this parallel universe. They say, oh, I was in a policy meeting, or oh, I was in a sit room. What did he say? And they read your Twitter feed and Peter's Twitter feed and Maggie's Twitter feed to find out what the latest is. But I wonder if any of the explanation or articulation that you've heard about why they stay, particularly after really bad moments like Charlottesville or like some of the incendiary outbursts on Twitter over nuclear issues, if any of that, if you view any of that in a different light with some of these conversations taking place in the last 7 days.
Well, one of the explanations you hear privately, and sometimes it's sort of articulated very clearly, and sometimes it's a little bit more of a wink and a nod, but is the explanation of, you know, I read your stories and you don't know the half of it. You don't know the things, the tweets we've prevented from being sent, the public statements never made, the bad decisions we've staunched. And so there is a sort of God complex or a patriotism, depending on how you look at it, to people staying and saying they're here because they, you know, they think being close to a president who many of them will say they respect, some less so, but who they are sometimes worried about, if they think that their presence can help, that is one of the arguments as to why they stay. It's certainly a salient argument in light of this current discussion, but all along the way, this is someone who, as we've reported very publicly, can be volatile and rash and erratic. And so there are people who say we like to surround ourselves, or we like to surround the president, rather, with ourselves, and we think we can try to temper some of his worst impulses. Although, again, everyone will say publicly and privately, you can't control him.
You can't control him, and you don't know the half of it, is the other one I hear. Perfectly said. We're going to let that be the last word in this block. Ashley Parker, thank you so much for starting us off. When we come back,